November 14th, 1940. Coventry, England, a city of 200,000 people about to become a graveyard. German bombers are approaching through total darkness. Thick clouds blanket the sky. No moon, no stars, no visibility whatsoever. The British defenders feel a flicker of relief. In these conditions, the Germans won't be able to see anything. They'll drop their bombs randomly and leave. But here's what happens instead. The bombers arrive with surgical precision. They hit aircraft factories, engine plants, the medieval cathedral. Block after block erupts in flames with impossible accuracy. How? How are they doing this? The answer sounds like science fiction. Invisible radio beams, broadcast from occupied Europe, guiding each bomber like railroad tracks in the sky. Germany has turned the invisible spectrum into a highway of destruction. One 28-year-old British physicist thinks he can bend those beams, redirect them, make German bombers drop their payloads on empty fields while they think they're over factories. The idea sounds insane. Most experts dismiss it as impossible. He has weeks to prove them wrong, or Britain's cities will burn one by one. By early 1940, Germany owned the European night sky. The Luftwaffe had solved aviation's most fundamental problem. How do you bomb a target you cannot see? Daylight raids were effective but suicidal. British fighters shredded bomber formations in clear weather. The math was brutal. Lose 10% of your force per raid, and you run out of crews within weeks. Night offered protection. Darkness made interception nearly impossible. But it created a different problem: navigation. A bomber crew flying at 15,000 feet through total darkness had essentially no way to know where they were. Dead reckoning using compass and airspeed worked over short distances, but even small errors accumulated over hundreds of kilometres. Crews would arrive somewhere over England, drop their bombs on whatever looked important, and hope they'd hit something valuable. The British assumed this limitation applied equally to everyone. Night bombing meant inaccurate bombing, random destruction. Terrible for morale, but strategically ineffective. Then the pattern changed. January 1940. British intelligence noticed something disturbing. German night raids were becoming more accurate, not slightly better, dramatically, impossibly better. Bombers were finding specific factories in total darkness: oil refineries, aircraft plants, rail yards, the kind of precision that should require daylight and visual identification. RAF intelligence officers examined wreckage of shot-down German aircraft, searching for new navigation equipment. They found nothing unusual: standard instruments, radio receivers, nothing that could explain the accuracy. The mystery deepened with every raid. Squadron leader Dennis Felkin interrogated a captured German bomber crew in March 1940. During questioning, the pilot mentioned something strange. He casually referenced following the beam to the target. Felkin pressed for details. The pilot seemed surprised by the question. He thought the British knew. "Everyone uses the beams," he said. "What beams?" The interrogation report landed on the desk of Dr. Reginald Victor Jones, 28 years old, physicist, Assistant Director of Intelligence at the Air Ministry. His job was scientific intelligence, understanding enemy technology before it killed British civilians. Jones read the report 3 times. Radio beams for navigation. It seemed impossible. British experts had considered radio beam navigation years earlier and dismissed it as impractical. The problem was physics. To create a beam narrow enough to guide an aircraft precisely, you would need an enormous directional antenna and massive transmitter power. The equipment would be the size of a building, and even then, atmospheric conditions would scatter the beam over distance, making it useless beyond a few dozen kilometres. But Jones had a different thought. What if German engineers had found a solution the British hadn't considered? He started researching German radio technology. Intelligence reports mentioned something called the Lorenz system. It was a commercial aircraft landing system developed in the 1930s. German civilian aircraft used it for instrument approaches in bad weather. The system worked by transmitting two overlapping radio beams. One broadcast a Morse code dot signal. The other broadcast a dash signal. Where they overlapped, pilots heard a steady tone. Follow that tone and you'd fly straight down the approach path to the runway. Jones understood the elegant simplicity. The Lorenz system didn't require a narrow beam. It used two wide beams with a narrow intersection zone. Much easier to build. Much longer range potential. He ran calculations. If you modified Lorenz equipment for longer range and higher power, if you placed transmitters in occupied France and Holland, if you angled the beams to intersect over British cities, you could create invisible highways in the sky. German bombers would simply follow the signal, listening for the steady tone that meant they were on course. When two beams intersected over a target, they'd know exactly where to drop bombs. The mathematics worked. It was theoretically possible. Jones prepared a briefing for RAF leadership, June 1940. He stood in front of skeptical officers and explained his theory. German bombers were using radio beams for precision navigation. Britain's cities were defenseless against a guidance system no one could see. Most of the room dismissed him. A physicist with a theory based on one prisoner's offhand comment. No hard evidence. No captured equipment. Just calculations and speculation. Several officers said it politely. Others were less diplomatic. The consensus was clear. Jones was chasing phantoms. But one person took him seriously. Winston Churchill had become Prime Minister in May 1940. Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany. France was collapsing. Invasion seemed imminent. Churchill understood that conventional thinking had led to disaster. He was willing to consider unconventional ideas, especially from intelligent young men who might be right. Churchill read Jones's report and called a meeting. If these beams existed, they represented a catastrophic vulnerability. German bombers could systematically destroy British industry, city by city, with impunity. But if Jones was wrong, resources would be wasted chasing invisible threats. Churchill made his decision. This must be investigated immediately. If Dr. Jones is correct, we need to know. And if he's correct, we need to find a way to stop it. Jones had authorization to prove his theory. He had one problem. How do you find something invisible? The answer would require flying directly into the path of German bombers, hunting for radio signals that might not exist, on the word of a captured pilot who might have been lying, and Jones had to find them before the next raid. June 21st, 1940. An Avro Anson aircraft lifted off from an RAF airfield in Worcestershire, carrying the most unusual mission of the war. The pilot was squadron leader Raymond Bluck. His orders were simple and completely bizarre. Fly over the English Midlands, listen to radio frequencies, try to detect German navigation beams that most experts believed didn't exist. The aircraft carried a hastily modified radio receiver and a young technician named Mackey who understood what they were looking for. Jones had calculated the likely frequencies based on captured Lorenz equipment specifications. The beams, if they existed, would operate around 30 MHz. Standard aircraft radio receivers didn't cover that range. The equipment had been modified in days, cobbled together from civilian radio parts and military components. Blucky flew the search pattern Jones had specified. Mackey monitored the receiver, adjusting frequencies, listening through headphones for anything unusual. For 2 hours, nothing. Just static and interference. Then Mackey heard it. A signal. Morse code dots. Steady, rhythmic, clear. He adjusted the aircraft's heading slightly. The dots transformed into a steady tone, then dashes on the other side. He centered the aircraft on the steady tone and told Bluck to follow it. They followed the beam for 20 minutes. It led them directly over Derby, specifically over the Rolls-Royce aircraft engine factory, one of Britain's most critical industrial targets. The beam was real. Jones had been right. Over the next week, RAF aircraft mapped multiple beam paths. All of them led to strategic targets: aircraft factories in Birmingham, dockyards in Liverpool, oil storage in Southampton. The Germans had constructed an invisible navigation network across occupied Europe, pointing directly at Britain's industrial heart. British leadership faced an immediate question. Now that we know about the beams, what do we do about them? The obvious answer was jamming. Broadcast noise on the same frequencies, overwhelm the German signals, blind them. But this had problems. German transmitters were enormously powerful, operating at kilowatt levels from large ground installations. British jamming transmitters would need comparable power to be effective. That meant massive equipment, extensive electrical infrastructure, and weeks or months of construction time. Worse, it would trigger an arms race. Germans would simply increase transmitter power. Britain would need more powerful jammers. Back and forth, escalating until both sides were operating transmitters the size of power stations. And the Germans had more territory, more resources, and more time to build larger installations. Jones proposed something different, something that sounded completely insane. Don't jam the beams, bend them. Here was his logic. German pilots were listening for a steady tone that indicated they were centered on the beam. That tone occurred where the dot signal and dash signal overlapped equally. But what if Britain broadcast additional dots or dashes on the same frequency? Not loud enough to overpower the German signal, just enough to create ambiguity. A German pilot would hear slightly more dots on one side of the beam. His training would tell him to drift toward the dashes to rebalance the signal. But if those extra dots were coming from a British transmitter, not atmospheric interference, he'd be drifting off course. Slowly, gradually, so subtly he wouldn't notice. Fly 20 kilometers to a target while being pulled 1 degree off course every few minutes, and you'd arrive 5 kilometers from where you thought you were. Your instruments would show you on target. You'd drop your bombs exactly where the beam intersection indicated, but you'd be over empty countryside, not a factory. The beauty of the system was its subtlety. If executed correctly, German crews would think they were experiencing atmospheric interference or equipment drift, natural phenomena, not deliberate countermeasures. They wouldn't realize their navigation system had been compromised. RAF technical officers were skeptical. The system required extraordinary precision. British transmitters would need to match German frequencies exactly. The false signals had to be strong enough to influence the pilots, but not so strong they'd be obvious. Timing was critical. The deception needed to start far from the target so the gradual drift seemed natural. And there was another problem. If Germany realized Britain was interfering with the beams, they'd change systems, develop new frequencies, new encoding, new techniques. Britain would lose its advantage and face an entirely new navigation system without advance warning. The counterargument was simpler. Without countermeasures, German bombers would systematically destroy British industrial capacity. With countermeasures, Britain had a chance. Churchill authorised the programme, codename Headache, an appropriate name for a system designed to give German navigators serious doubts about their instruments. British engineers began constructing transmitter stations across England. The equipment was relatively simple compared to high-power jamming systems. Modified Lorenz transmitters, directional antennas, operators who could monitor German beam frequencies and broadcast false signals at precisely calibrated power levels. The first stations became operational in August 1940. Operators began broadcasting false dots and dashes on known German beam frequencies. Then they waited to see if anyone noticed. RAF intelligence monitored German communications through multiple channels: decrypted radio traffic, prisoner interrogations, reconnaissance photographs of bombing damage. The evidence came in pieces, but the pattern was clear. German bombs were falling in the wrong places. Not dramatically wrong, just a few kilometers off target. Enough to miss factories and hit residential areas or open fields. German crews reported successful missions, unaware they'd bombed nothing of value. The impossible idea was working. Britain was bending reality itself, and Germany had no idea. But the system was about to face its ultimate test. November 1940. Intelligence intercepts revealed a massive raid planned against a specific target. Code name Mondscheinsonate, Moonlight Sonata. The target was Coventry, and German bombers would be using a new, more sophisticated beam system that British countermeasures weren't designed to stop. November 12, 1940. Bletchley Park. British codebreakers decrypted a Luftwaffe communication that made everyone in the room go silent. Operation Mondscheinsonate. Moonlight Sonata. A massive raid scheduled for November 14th or 15th, depending on weather. The target appeared to be a city with codename Corn. British intelligence worked frantically to identify which city. The options were grim: Coventry, Birmingham, or Wolverhampton, all major industrial centres. But there was something else in the intercept, a reference to X-Gerät, X-device. A navigation system intelligence had heard mentioned but knew almost nothing about. And that lack of knowledge was terrifying. Jones received the information with dread. If X-Gerät was a new beam system and British countermeasures were calibrated for Knickerbein, the headache transmitters might be completely ineffective. He had less than 3 days to understand a system he'd never seen and develop countermeasures for a raid that could kill thousands. Intelligence pieced together fragments. X-Gerät was more sophisticated than Knickerbein. Instead of two intersecting beams marking a target, X-Gerät used a single narrow beam with multiple crossbeams marking distance checkpoints. The bomber would fly along the main beam. When it crossed the first marker, the navigator would start a clock. Second marker, adjust the clock. Third marker, the system automatically released bombs at the calculated distance. It was semi-automatic precision bombing. The system was operated by Kampfgruppe 100, an elite Luftwaffe Pathfinder unit. Their job was to arrive first, mark targets with incendiaries, and guide the main bomber force that would follow using standard Knickerbein beams. Jones's analysis was brutally honest. British countermeasures could handle the main force using Knickerbein, but X-Gerät, the system was too new. Headache transmitters weren't configured for its frequencies. There wasn't time to build new equipment or train operators. By November 14th, intelligence confirmed the target: Coventry, a city of 200,000 people, home to aircraft factories, engine plants, and munitions works. One of Britain's most critical industrial centres. Churchill faced an impossible decision. Ultra-intelligence, the secret decryption of German codes, was Britain's most valuable asset. If Britain evacuated Coventry or deployed massive defensive forces, Germany might realise their codes were broken. That would mean losing the intelligence advantage for the entire war. Thousands saved in Coventry, but millions potentially lost elsewhere. Churchill made his choice. Civil defence would be alerted, but subtly. Fire brigades prepared, medical services readied, but no evacuation, no extraordinary measures that would reveal foreknowledge. headache transmitters would operate against the main force. X-Duret-equipped pathfinders would likely get through. At 1900 hours on November 14th, German bombers began taking off from airfields in occupied France. Kampfgruppe 100 departed first. 13 Heinkel. He won 11 bombers equipped with X-Duret, carrying incendiaries to mark Coventry for the following waves. British headache operators powered up their transmitters. They could do nothing about X-Duret, but they could try to deflect the main force. The operators began broadcasting false signals on Knickerbein frequencies, attempting to bend the beams away from Coventry. At 1920 hours, air raid sirens wailed across Coventry. The pathfinders arrived precisely on target. X-Duret had guided them with devastating accuracy. Incendiaries rained down on the city centre, creating dozens of fires that would serve as visual markers for the main force. Then the main force arrived. 449 bombers, the largest German raid yet mounted against a single British city. Each aircraft followed Knickerbein beams toward Coventry, but British headache transmitters were pulling those beams sideways, degree by degree. Some bombers followed the false signals. Their pilots, hearing unbalanced dot and dash signals, corrected their course to follow what they thought was the beam. They arrived miles from Coventry and dropped their bombs on empty fields and small villages. Crews reported successful attacks on what they believed was the target, but many bombers used the Pathfinder fires as visual reference. They ignored their instruments and bombed what they could see burning. The sophisticated beam navigation became irrelevant. The X-Duret Pathfinders had done their job too well. The raid lasted 11 hours. 503 tons of high explosives and 30,000 incendiaries fell on Coventry. The medieval cathedral was destroyed. Aircraft factories were damaged but not obliterated. Entire residential districts burned. By dawn on November 15th, 568 people were dead and thousands more injured. The devastation was severe, but Jones's analysis afterward revealed something crucial. The raid should have been worse, much worse. Bomb plot maps showed a clear pattern. Roughly half the German force had dropped ordnance outside the city limits. Bombs fell on suburbs, villages, and farmland in a scatter pattern consistent with navigation error. The headache transmitters had worked. Not perfectly, not enough to prevent catastrophe, but enough to cut the raid's effectiveness significantly. Aircraft factories that should have been obliterated remained partially operational. The city was wounded, not destroyed. German crews reported overwhelming success. Their instruments had shown them on target. The Pathfinder fires had confirmed it. They had no idea that many of them had been guided miles off course by invisible British transmitters. But Coventry introduced a new problem. X-Duret Pathfinders made beam bending only partially effective. If Germany deployed more sophisticated systems, British countermeasures would become obsolete. The invisible war had just escalated, and Jones needed to find a way to bend beams he still barely understood. The morning after Coventry, Jones sat in his office reviewing bomb plot maps. The pattern was unmistakable. Two distinct clusters. One centered on Coventry itself, where Pathfinder fires had drawn bombers visually. Another scattered across a wide area to the east and south, where Knickerbein-equipped aircraft had followed bent beams to wrong locations. He calculated percentages. Approximately 40% of the attacking force had been successfully diverted. Their bombs fell on fields, small villages, and empty countryside. If all 449 bombers had hit Coventry accurately, the city would have ceased to exist as an industrial centre. Instead, damaged factories were already resuming partial production. The human arithmetic was grimmer. Those diverted bombs had killed people in places that weren't supposed to be targets. Small communities obliterated by ordnance meant for Coventry. The moral calculus of deflected destruction. Save hundreds in the primary target by sacrificing dozens elsewhere. Jones would wrestle with that arithmetic for the rest of his life. But the strategic reality was clear. Beam bending worked. Britain now possessed a defensive weapon that Germany didn't know existed. The invisible war could continue. Over the following months, the cat-and-mouse game intensified. German engineers, frustrated by increasing navigation failures, developed yet another system. Wii, codename Wotan. This system was even more sophisticated than X-Jarrett, a single beam with ground-controlled distance measurement. The bomber would fly the beam while ground controllers tracked its position using radio ranging. When the aircraft reached the correct distance, controllers would send a signal triggering automatic bomb release. It was ingenious. The bomber crew didn't need to navigate, they just flew the beam. Ground controllers in occupied Europe did all the calculation. Human judgment was removed from the equation. Jones learned about Wii through signals intelligence in early 1941. Once again, he faced a system he barely understood with weeks to develop countermeasures. But this time he had experience, and he understood the fundamental principle. Every radio system that depended on timing and distance could be fooled with false signals. British engineers developed a counter-system, codename Domino. The principle was elegant. If German ground controllers were measuring distance by timing radio signals, British transmitters could inject false timing signals, make the bomber appear farther along the beam than it actually was. The controllers would trigger bomb release too early or too late. Either way, bombs would miss the target. The first test came in May 1941. German bombers equipped with Wii targeted Birmingham. Intelligence had intercepted the plan. Domino transmitters went active. British operators broadcast false ranging signals, telling German controllers that bombers were approaching the target when they were actually miles away. Bomb release signals went out early. German bombers dropped their ordnance over the suburbs of Wolverhampton, 15 kilometres from intended targets in Birmingham. Aircraft factories and munitions plants remained untouched. Residential areas of Wolverhampton burned instead. The same terrible arithmetic. Lives traded for strategic objectives. German post-raid analysis was confused. Crews reported following procedures correctly. Equipment had functioned normally, yet bombs had clearly missed the target. Some attributed it to atmospheric conditions. Others blamed crew error. No one suspected that British transmitters were rewriting their distance calculations in real time. The Battle of the Beams reached its conclusion not through decisive victory, but through strategic shift. June 1941. Germany invaded the Soviet Union. Operation Barbarossa. The Luftwaffe was redeployed eastward by the hundreds of aircraft. The bombing campaign against Britain diminished to occasional harassment raids. By this point, British countermeasures had evolved to handle all three major German beam systems. Knickerbein could be bent. X-Jarrett could be jammed with targeted interference. Wii could be spoofed with false ranging signals. The technological chess match had reached a stalemate, with Britain holding a defensive advantage that Germany never fully understood. The quantifiable impact was significant. Between August 1940 and June 1941, an estimated 30 to 40% of German bombs aimed at British industrial targets fell outside intended impact zones. Thousands of tons of ordnance wasted on empty fields. Dozens of raids partially or completely deflected from critical factories. The human cost was measured in lives not lost. Post-war analysis suggested that beam bending saved between 15,000 and 20,000 British civilian lives. People who would have died in accurate raids on industrial centres but survived because German bombers were guided to wrong locations. These were invisible victories. Statistical lives saved in disasters that were prevented or diminished. But the Battle of the Beams established something far more significant than tactical success. It created the template for modern electronic warfare. The principle that Jones had proven was revolutionary. You don't defeat enemy technology by overpowering it. You defeat it by understanding it better than the enemy does and exploiting its assumptions. Every radio navigation system assumed that broadcast signals were trustworthy. German pilots never questioned whether the dots and dashes they heard were genuine. Controllers never doubted their distance measurements. The systems worked flawlessly in testing because no one was actively trying to deceive them. Jones had recognized that trust was a vulnerability. He transformed invisible radio signals into weapons of deception. The electromagnetic spectrum became a battlefield where truth and lies were indistinguishable. This concept would define warfare for the next 80 years. Radar jamming, GPS spoofing, communications interception, cyber operations, all descended from the same insight. If your enemy depends on electronic systems, those systems can be deceived. The scientists who pioneered these techniques worked in absolute secrecy. Their successes looked like enemy failures. Their victories were measured in attacks that never achieved objectives, in disasters slightly less catastrophic than planned. They saved lives that were never counted because those people never knew they were in danger. Jones himself remained largely unknown outside intelligence circles for decades. His work was classified until the 1970s. When he finally published his memoir, Most Secret War, the world learned that one of World War II's most critical battles had been fought in the invisible spectrum by scientists armed with nothing but mathematics and transmitters. The beams that once guided German bombers to British cities are long silent. But the war they began has never ended. Return to that November night in 1940. Coventry burning. German bombers overhead, following invisible beams with absolute confidence. Their instruments showing them exactly on target. Reality telling them something different. How do you fight invisible beams? The question that seemed impossible in June had been answered by November. You fight them with invisible lies. The paradox at the heart of the Battle of the Beams was this: the most sophisticated weapon didn't win. Understanding won. Germany had engineered brilliant navigation systems, powerful transmitters, precision instruments. They had turned radio waves into highways through the darkness. But they had made one critical assumption: that the signals their pilots heard were real. Jones recognized that assumption as a vulnerability. He didn't need to build more powerful transmitters than Germany. He didn't need to overpower their signals. He just needed to whisper lies into the same frequency. Subtle enough that German pilots would think they were hearing atmospheric interference. Gradual enough that the drift seemed natural. Devastating enough to pull bombers miles off course while their instruments showed them perfectly on target. This was asymmetric warfare in its purest form. Germany spent enormous resources building transmission networks across occupied Europe. Britain countered with hastily modified equipment and a handful of operators who understood the enemy's system better than the enemy did. Pennies of British investment defeating millions of German Reichsmarks. Knowledge triumphing over engineering. The success was measured in negative space, in bombs that fell on empty fields instead of factories, in casualties that never happened, in industrial production that continued because the raids meant to stop it had been deflected by degrees. These were invisible victories, the best kind because the enemy never realized they'd been defeated. Churchill later wrote that Jones had saved Britain during its darkest hour, not with guns or bombs, but with physics and deception, by proving that the impossible was merely difficult and the difficult was achievable with sufficient understanding and audacity. The legacy extends far beyond World War II. Every GPS-guided weapon can be spoofed. Every radar can be jammed or deceived. Every communication can be intercepted or falsified. The electromagnetic spectrum remains a battlefield where the most sophisticated equipment is vulnerable to clever deception. Modern militaries spend billions on electronic warfare capabilities, all descended from the principles Jones established in 1940. But there's a darker legacy too: the ethical weight of invisible warfare. Jones knew when raids were coming but couldn't prevent all the destruction. He deflected bombs from factories to villages, from industrial targets to residential areas. He saved thousands of lives through decisions that killed dozens. The moral calculus of defensive deception. These weren't clean victories. They were necessary compromises in a war where every choice carried a body count. In the end, the Battle of the Beams teaches one fundamental lesson. In technological warfare, the greatest advantage isn't the strongest signal. It's knowing your enemy's system better than they do. It's recognizing that every sophisticated technology contains assumptions that can be exploited. It's understanding that precision can be turned into vulnerability with nothing more than mathematics and audacity. With invisible beams, Germany tried to rewrite the rules of aerial warfare. With invisible lies, one British physicist rewrote them back, and in doing so, he saved thousands of lives that were never counted. Because the best victories are the disasters that never happen,